Chapters 1 through 4 of Aristotle's Categories, sometimes referred to as the pre-predicamenta, present various preliminary points prior to the detailed discussion of the doctrine of some of the major categories or predicamenta. I have presented my notes on the first two chapters in previous videos. Chapter 3 begins with the principle of transitivity in predication. Hotan heteron kath heteru kategoretai hos kat hypokemenu, hosa katatu kategorumenu legetai, panta kai katatu hypokemenu retesetai. Whenever one thing is predicated of another as of a subject, all things said of what is predicated will be said also of the subject. For example, man is predicated of the individual man, hotis anthropos, anthroposistin. Animal is predicated of man, anthropos stoionistin. Therefore, animal can be predicated of the individual man, hotis anthropos stoion. This seems straightforward, but Porphyry's pupil comes up with a counterexample that would seem to vitiate this rule. In fact, this difficulty, atopia as Porphyry calls it, or dilemma, aporia as others called it, reappears in several of the ancient commentaries. Stephen Strange breaks down the Aristotelian commentaries into three groups. The first were devotees of Aristotle, the greatest of whom was Alexander of Aphrodisias, the head of the Peripatetic school at Athens around 200 CE, roughly 500 years after Aristotle. The largest number of extant commentaries comes from the second group, Neoplatonists, who nevertheless wrote commentaries about Aristotle, beginning as we saw in earlier notes with Plotinus's pupil Porphyry. The third group comes from Byzantium many centuries later. The commentaries I'm going to look at that address this particular atopia or aporia all come from the Neoplatonists. The difficulty, suggests Porphyry's pupil, is this. In Aristotle's example, substituting Socrates for the individual man, man is said of Socrates as of a subject. Animal is said of man, so animal is also said of Socrates. But species, eidos, is also said of man, for man is a species, but Socrates is not a species. Some other commentators climb up one rung on the classification ladder and add the example of genus. Animal is said of man as a subject, for man is an animal. Genus is said of animal, for animal is a genus, but man is not a genus. The four commentators I'm going to look at in chronological order are Porphyry, Dexippus, Boethius, and Simplicius. Their solutions are similar, but their language varies. Porphyry replies to his student with essentially two arguments for solving the atopia. First, he returns to his previously given interpretation of what Aristotle meant by said of something. According to that interpretation, Aristotle in our passage added the qualifying phrase as of a subject to restrict things said of something to those said in the essence, in toitiesti, and said synonymously, that is, said with both the name of the thing said and the defining account of the name applying to the subject. Having said hotan heteron kath heteru kategoretai hos kat hypokemenu, Porphyry says, Aristotle has given us to understand what is predicated synonymously and in the essence of the predicate term. Dedokian hypolabein to synonymos kai entoitiesti toteni kauta. The next clause, hosa kata tu kategorumenu legetai, must be understood, he says, in this restricted sense. It is as if, instead of having written hosa katatu kategorumenu legetai panta kai katatu hypokemenu retesetai, Aristotle had written hosa katatu kategorumenu legetai tos auta kai katatu hypokemenu retesetai. Those raising the difficulty, he tells his pupil, misinterpret the restricted sense of panta here. Now the predication eidos of man does not meet this restricted definition. The name eidos applies to man, for man is a species, but not its account. Umen en toi tiestin ho anthropos toi erotonti perites usias autu hetisistin apodothe an hoti eidos al hoti stoion. You would not reply to someone asking what is the essence of man that he is a species, but rather that he is an animal. Second, Porphyry says eidos is predicated in a special sense, a distinction almost as if, interestingly, Porphyry were inventing a new Aristotelian category. As follows, using a modified version of Stephen Strange's translation, to de eidos legistai ton anthropon antidiaeretai, man being called a species is opposed as one member of a logical classification, antidiaeretai, pros tome ton atomon enai, alaton katakoinoteta pros agoraomenon, namely as being not of individual things, but of things addressed with respect to their commonality, katakoinoteta. To de katakoinoteta ton anthropon legistai, in turn, man being called with respect to his commonality, sumbebe kotos esti parastatikon malon e usias, is indicative of accident rather than essence. Sumbebe kotos de utu kyrios ala tu eoikotos diaporaitini, but not of accident in the strict sense, but of something like some differentia. He un katakoinoteta eidos ho anthropos legatai kai kathos genos tos doion. Qua predicated in common, man is said to be a species, and with respect to its genus and animal. Sumbebeca de tutois, it is an accident of these, kataple onon enai peri ectica, that they include a multiplicity of things. In de toi tiestin he usia tu anthropu categoretai, but the essence of man is predicated in toi tiestin. Dexippus was a pupil of the Neoplatonist Iamblichus, whose own commentary on the categories is lost. In fact, Dexippus wrote a work specifically on the aporiae leveled against the categories and the solutions to these. Dexipu Platonicu ton estas Aristotelus categorias aporionta kai luseon. He did this in the form of a dialogue between himself and a certain Seleucus. Aporia number 27 in Book 1 is Diati homen anthropos katasokratus to de eidos uketi, specifically that Socrates is a man but not a species, and a man is an animal but not a genus. In Dexippus's reply, I count essentially 4 arguments similar in substance to Porphyry. I am using with modifications the English translation of John Dillon in the Bloomsbury edition. Dexippus first has recourse to the peripatetic construal of said of something that we are familiar with. Hoti kata tunoma umentoi kataton logon kategoretai ta anotero kataton hypokemenon, that the higher terms, meaning eidos and genos, are predicated of the subjects by name, but not by defining account. Second, with a striking repetition of Porphyry's phrase antidiaeretai pros, Dexippus argues that eidos and genos are predications of accident, not substance. Eti tomen eidos kai to genos alois sumbebeca. Furthermore, on the one hand, species and genus happen to different things as accidents, kai antidiaeretai, and each is opposed as one member of a logical classification, tomen pros tome ton edon enai, toda pros tome ton atomon enai, namely, the one as not being of species, the other as not being of individuals. tade kat hypokemenu legomena sumplerotika tes usias ein. Whereas, on the other hand, things said of a subject are constitutive of its essence. And further, some things are said of all of a subject. Eti tamen katapantos legetai, pas gar anthropos stoion elogos an retee, pas de anthropos eidos pseudos an retee. For every man could be reasonably said to be an animal, but to say that every man is a species would be false. For these things, meaning eidos and genos, are not said of all of a subject, but will only be said of them in the way that commonalities are. Uk ara katapantos tauta al hoti koinote tesesin hutokat auton retesontai. Fourth, Dexippus, like Porphyry, posits a unique lexical function for the predications eidos and genos. Kai hoti tomen sumplerotikon en tes usias, toda indektikon tes tu onomatos katakoinen skesin tesaos. And because the one, meaning anthropos and stoion, is constitutive of the essence, while the other, meaning eidos and genos, is indicative of the imposition of the name denoting a common relation. Malon un eoiken haute koinotes tu onomatos enai parastatike parapoian skesin onomastai ho anthropos etois doion. This commonality, then, seems rather indicative of the name, indicating according to what context skesis, man or animal, have been used as names. Ka estin onomata onomaton deutera proteron, and some names are secondary to other, primary ones. Al uchites pro egumenes ekatai ton lexon semasias, but do not depend on the principal meaning of the expressions. Udeten pusin autein semine ton onomas domenon pragmaton, nor do they signify the actual nature of the things named, ala kata poion onomastai charactera indecnutai, but indicate the characteristic according to which they are named. By the way, the CAG editor of the Greek text is doubtful that the clause kai estin onomata onomaton deutera proteron is genuine, which we only note because we find the phrase echoed in Boethius. Boethius's commentary on Chapter 3 of the Categories also begins with the peripatetic assertion that Aristotle at the beginning of Chapter 3 is supplying his definition of said of something. Pate facto igitur quid sit esse in subjecto, having just defined, that is in Chapter 2, what in a subject means, now he shows what to be predicated of a subject means. Nunc quid sit praedicari de subjecto declarat. For predications are of two types, one secundum accidens, one de subjecto. And he gives examples: man is white and man is an animal. Here is the difference. Sed illa prior praedicatio, quae est homo albus est, secundum accidens est, namque accidens, quod est album, de subjecto homine praedicatur, sed non in eo quod quid sit. That prior predication, which is man is white, is predication in accordance with accident. For accident, which white is predicated of man as subject, but not in its essence. In eo quod quid sit is Boethius's rendering of the Greek in toitiastin. Nam cum album sit accidens homo substantia, accidens de substantia in eo quod quid sit praedicari non potest, ergo ista praedicatio secundum accidens dicitur. For since white is an accident, man a substance, an accident cannot be predicated of a substance in its essence, and therefore this type of predication is said to be secundum accidens. De subjecto vero praedicare est, quota es altera res de altera in ipsa substantia praedicatur, ut animal de homine. Predication de subjecto, however, is whenever something is predicated of something else in the substance itself, as animal of man, etc. Quare illa sola de subjecto praedicare dicuntur, quaecunque in cuius lobet rei substantia et in definitione ponuntur. Therefore only those things are said to be predicated de subjecto which are posited of one thing or another in the substance and in the definition, i.e. the entoitisti. Boethius proceeds to explain Aristotle's principle of transitivity and how it must be understood in this restricted sense of predications in eo quod quid sit. On that point he sums up, ergo constat huius modi definitio. Therefore a definition of this type, referring to the principle of transitivity, is manifest, quae dicet quota es alterum de altero praedicatur ut de subjecto, siquid sit, quod de eo quod praedicatur in eo quod quid sit dici possit, hoc idem ipsum de eo quod prius subjectum erat possit praedicare. Which says, as often as something is said of something else as of a subject, if there is something that can be said in eo quod quid sit of that which is predicated, this very same thing can be said of that which was earlier the subject. And now the aporia. Sed fortasse quisquam dicat minime verum esse quod dictum est. Because, and he illustrates with the same predications of species and of genus that Dexippus used. Remind such objectors, Boethius says, of the definition just given of predication de subjecto. His dicendum est, quod minus adverterent, illam esse definitionem de subjecto praedicationis, quae in eo quod quid sit unum quodque et in eius substantia praedicaretur. Nunc autem species de homine non in eo quod quid sit praedicatur. Species is predicated of man, not in eo quod quid sit. Second, Boethius bequeaths to his Latin audience the argument that the predications species and genus have a unique lexical function, though his argument seems to be not precisely the same as that of Porphyry or Dexippus. Neque enim siquis hominis definitionem redat speciem nominavit, sed designativum nomen est tantum. For neither if someone should produce the definition of man, has he called man a species, but species is an indicative name only, indicating utrum de pluribus specie differentibus praedicatur hoc nomen quod est homo, ancerte tantum de solis individuis. Whether this name homo is predicated of multiple things differing in species, i.e. homo as genus, or indeed is predicated of individuals strictly as individuals, i.e. homo as species. Third, Boethius asserts, without further elaboration, et sunt quodam modo nominum nomina, and genus and species are in some sense names of names. This is the assertion we saw in Dexippus as kai estin onomata onomaton deltera proteron. Stephen Strange notes that in this section of his commentary, Boethius is following some source other than Porphyry, though he does not say that that source is Dexippus. Boethius restates the designativum nomen argument, quare neque genus de animali, neque species de homine, in eo quod quid sit praedicatur, sed tantum designant, quomodo homo et animal de subjectis propriis praedicentur. Therefore, neither genus of animal nor species of man is predicated in eo quod quid sit, but they only indicate how man and animal are predicated of their subjects. He concludes this, his reply to a hypothetical objector, with a rhetorical flourish. Ergo non est mirandum, si ad eorum subjectum, quae de subjecto dicuntur, eius praedicati quod de subjecto non dicitur praedicatio perveniri non potest. Therefore, it should not be thought strange if the predication of that predicated thing which is not said de subjecto, in other words, species or genus, cannot come to be included in the subject of those things that are said de subjecto, in other words, like homo of Socrates and animal of homo. Monica Astsalos, from whom we hope to one day get a translation of Boethius's commentary on the categories, says in an article on Boethius as a transmitter of Greek logic to the Latin West that classicists are often repelled by Boethius's inelegant Latin, awkwardly influenced by the Greek. Having had to struggle through my own translation of this section in Boethius's commentary, I have come to the same conclusion. Simplicius is the last chronologically of the Neoplatonic commentators to address this aporia, at least that I am aware of. Simplicius wrote an enormous body of commentaries on Aristotle and other philosophers, and is known especially as the source of many of our verbatim fragments of the pre-Socratic philosophers. His aporia for our passage is that of genus, that man is called animal and animal genus, but man is not a genus. He begins his refutation with a self-confident assertion, a la prokeros helusis, of the various arguments we are by now familiar with. I am using the English translation with modifications of Michael Chase in the Bloomsbury edition. One modification is that Chase translates hypokemenon as substrate, but to be consistent with other translators and with my own notes, I translate it as subject. Alla prokeros helusis hotitogenos kan kategoretai tu stoiu alukos kat hypokemenu. But the solution is close to hand, namely that genos, though predicated of animal, is not predicated of it as of a subject. Hegar an katapantos stoiu kategoreto, nunde stoio menestin kai hosokrates umentoi genos. For if it were, genos would be predicated of every animal. As things are, however, although Socrates too is an animal, yet he is not a genos. Ugar entoitiastin kategoretai tu stoiu to genos, for genus is not predicated of animal entoitiastin, ugar to hopos depota kategorumenon hos kat hypokemenu kategoretai. For it is not the case that everything which is predicated in any way whatsoever is predicated as of a subject. Simplicius gives as an example Socrates peripate, Socrates walks. Peripatein is predicated of Socrates, but not as of a subject. Teknusin men un hoper epon diatu nun retentos, kai tiestin tokat hypokemenu legastai, hotito sun onumos kategorestai. Thus, as I said, Aristotle shows by means of the present passage as well what it is to be said of a subject, namely, that it is to be predicated synonymously. Simplicius proceeds with the argument we are familiar with, that Aristotle's principle of transitivity is restricted in this way, but he does so in terms of the 10 categories. Kai ekeno de malista didaske, hoti hutinos an kat hypokemenu legetaiti, kai he kategoria es hen an agetai to kategorumenon legetai kat autu. Aristotle especially teaches the following point, that of whatever something is said as of a subject, the category to which the something said is referred to is said as well of it, namely the subject. Chase gives the formula here in a footnote. If X is predicated of Y as of a subject, and X is subsumed under category C, then Y falls under category C as well. Example: Egartos doion kat hypokemenu legatai tu anthropu, an agetai de tos doion esten usian, kai ho anthropos esten ousian anakthesetai. For if animal is said of man as of a subject, but animal is referred to substance, then man too will be referred to substance. Simplicius generalizes the point. Kai dia tutu tuta orematos takat hekasta kai aperilepta toi logismoi diaton oikeon epanabibasmon estas deca categorias sun aeretai. It is, moreover, by means of this theorem that individual things, which reasoning cannot grasp by means of their proper stages of ascent, are concentrated into the 10 categories. For it cannot be clearly known that Socrates is a substance unless one travels through many of the things predicated synonymously of what is beneath each of them, that is, things that are said of a subject. Hotigar ousia estin ho Socrates, uk estin gnonai sapos, me dia polon ton sun onumos aeton hype auta categorumenon hodelsanta, tut estin ton kat hypokemenu legomenon. And Simplicius goes on to refer Socrates up the ladder of these synonymous predications of anthropos, man, stoion, animal, psychon, ensouled or animate, and ousia, substance. Simplicius uses first the metaphor of the steps of a ladder, ep anabibasmon, then that of a traveler, hodelsanta, to describe the ascent up the ontological scale that ends in the categories. Chase notes that ep anabibasmon comes from a coinage in Plato's Symposium. Comparison of this passage affords a nice contrast between Plato and Aristotle. Recall that Socrates in the Symposium recounts to his fellow banqueters how he was instructed in the philosophy of love once upon a time from a certain Mantinean woman named Diotima. Our passage comes near the end of that, dare I say, immortal speech. Tuto gar deesti to orthos epita erotica ienai ehup alu agestai, using Seth Bernardetti's translation, for this is what it is to proceed correctly, or to be led by another, to erotics. Arkomenon apotondeton kalon ekenu heneka tu kalu ae ep anienai, hosper ep anabasmois kromenon. Beginning from these beautiful things here, always to proceed on up for the sake of that beauty, the universal beauty that is, using these beautiful things here as steps. Apohenos epiduo kai apoduoin epipanta takala somata, from 1 to 2 and from 2 to all beautiful bodies, kai apoton kalon somaton epitakala epitedomata, kai apoton epitedomaton epitakala mathemata, kai apoton mathematon ep ekeno to mathemateleutesai, hoestin uk alu e autu ekenu tu kalu mathema, hinagnoi auto teleuton ho esti kalon. And from beautiful bodies to beautiful pursuits, and from pursuits to beautiful lessons, and from lessons to end at that lesson, which is the lesson of nothing else than the beautiful itself, and at last to know what is beauty itself. Plato has Socrates ascending to the form of beauty itself. Aristotle, as read by Simplicius, has Socrates ascending the ontological scale of species and genera to the category substance. Back to our aporia. John Dillon, the translator of Dexippus, notes that this aporia, dealt with similarly in substance but in verbally distinct ways by Porphyry, Dexippus, and Simplicius, is caused by Aristotle's failure in Chapter 3 to distinguish between the relation of an individual to its species and that of a species to its genus, leaving it to his exegetes to specify what attributes of the predicate and essential predication will also apply to the subject. Ackrell also makes this point and says it does not occur to Aristotle that man functions differently in Socrates is a man and man is an animal. I quote this in part because Acro makes an important observation, to wit, that there is no indefinite article in Greek, which makes translating and even interpreting the Greek a bit tricky.